East Harlem is a vibrant neighborhood, rich in artistic expression and cultural diversity. Walk down the streets and you see public murals, community gardens, and shops and restaurants representing the traditions of more than a dozen communities. Speak to the residents and you hear repeated again and again an extraordinarily strong commitment to East Harlem and its history and traditions. But these days, conversations with long-term community members also evoke expressions of concern that East Harlem's cultural riches are under threat. 20 years ago, residents worried about housing abandonment and arson. Now they express fear that rising property values and new construction will displace them and their neighbors, unraveling the complex social fabric that makes East Harlem one of New York City's most exciting and interesting neighborhoods. A neighborhood that for its long-term residents is and should remain home.
My name is Nellie Plumet, and I live in East Harlem all my life, born and raised, and I love it. What I love about it is the culture, the people. I was born here, so I know what it looked like. I've seen what it's become, and I'm looking at what it's going to be. My mother was born and raised in Puerto Rico. My father is French, born in France, Marseille. Came, my mother, they met, married, and 8 kids later. I was in that particular building, born and raised on 109th Street till I was about 5 or 6, which at the time was sort of like an Italian neighborhood. We were then relocated, my family and I, and the buildings were knocked down. They were brownstones, and lo and behold, schools were created there, and then my 2 kids wound up in those schools. What was also part of that area was La Marqueta, which is on 116th Street, which was this big marketplace that people came from all over. The subways was there, and you shop. Every cubicle, every street had, you walked through, and there were stands of fruits and vegetables, and particularly the fish one, you could smell it 100 miles away. There was clothing that actually was, we used to call, sunning out there. People would hang it outside, and if you would buy your clothes on time, it was a little stain because the sun, If you ask my kids, they say I'm a little too nostalgic or sentimental. We'll walk down the street and I'll say, you see that, and you see this. Yes, we heard it, but I have to keep, I think they need to know. They need to know how much has changed. What today is a building used to be, or what today is a funeral home, let's say, used to be just a nice brownstone with neighbors, people we knew, and now, or a bank, used to be a bank, now it's nothing more than a pet shop or something.
During the 17th century, early Dutch settlers displaced the original Wixkajee inhabitants and established farms on the site of present-day East Harlem. The area remained rural until the mid-19th century, when shantytowns sprang up to house the city's growing population of laborers. In the last 2 decades of the 1800s, new elevated trains connected East Harlem to the rest of Manhattan and the Bronx, and developers quickly built tenement apartments for working-class families throughout the neighborhood. During the mid-1800s, East Harlem's population consisted largely of Irish and German communities. These immigrants were joined by Jews, Italians, and African Americans at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. By the 1920s, East Harlem was home to the largest Italian community in the U.S. In the 1920s and 1930s, Puerto Ricans began settling in East Harlem in large numbers, and their neighborhood became one of the most important centers of Puerto Rican culture in New York City. During the period following the Second World War, East Harlem's Puerto Rican and African American communities became the largest 2 population groups in the neighborhood. In the 1980s and 1990s, East Harlem became home for a number of new immigrant communities from countries such as the Dominican Republic, Honduras, El Salvador, Colombia, Brazil, China, the Philippines, and particularly Mexico. In 2000, African Americans and Puerto Ricans were the single largest population groups in the neighborhood at 34 and 32% of the population, respectively.
My name is Derek Tate, and I live in East Harlem. I've been a resident of East Harlem from birth for 50 years, 51 years. East Harlem, it's just a serious cultural mix, unlike any other part of the city, I think. You know, I go back to the old days of the original La Marqueta, where my grandparents were immigrants that came from Barbados. My grandfather and grandmother came here through Ellis Island. My grandfather came here with $38 in his pocket. My grandfather, before he died a few years ago, had 15 buildings between 117th and 126th Street. Majority of my relatives are older. Everyone's a homeowner. You know, they purchased homes back in the 40s and 50s, and a lot of them stayed, some sold out and left. But majority of them are still here. Those that are still alive, they're still here. And they don't plan to go anywhere. We have a crew here in Harlem, and the other Tate family lives up in New Rochelle and Larchmont. So we were the Harlem Tates. Looked down upon until as of recent. Now everyone in the suburbs wants to buy a house here in Harlem. And you know, East Harlem can be a lot of things. There's a lot of good people in East Harlem. There's a lot of good people, people that have gone on to big things, but we need them back. Because one thing we did, the poor stayed, and the middle class, there was no provision for middle class in East Harlem. So the middle class from all these cultures left.
Actually, I was born in East Harlem in 1949, and we moved out of East Harlem at I was about the age of 5 or 6. We moved to the outer boroughs, to Queens, to the Bronx, and then I decided in 1981 to move back to Harlem. I don't know, I had experience of the outer boroughs, and I found a lot of like diversity and a lot of activity and warmth in East Harlem. The warmth I was talking about is that I was able to find a place to live and also find a place to work in the same community. And that's ideal. I mean, most people don't work and live in the same community. And so I was able to walk to work and walk home. And in walking the streets of East Harlem, you know, I met a lot of people, I made friends and so forth, and you know, and I've gotten to know a lot of people in the neighborhood that way. And that's something that you can't do out in the suburbs, and you can't do that south of 96th Street because everybody is in these high-rise buildings, and they have no contact with the street.
My name is Father Victor Musin. I'm an Italian priest by birth, and that I arrived here in 1990 at St. Anne's Church on 110th Street. I was there until 2 years ago when I was assigned here at St. Francis de Sales Church. I always lived in an English-speaking background, and then when I arrived there in El Barrio, everything was Spanish, you know? And I didn't realize that in No, I didn't know a word of it. And I picked it up on the street, and I became pretty good at it.
My name is William, and I feel like there's like even amount of good things to do in the community. Like if you want to go shopping, there's about 100 clothes stores all over the place. You want to get something to eat, you have a different variety. If you want to go hang out somewhere, you have parks all up and down the block. And like anything else you want to do, you can do.
I love that we have a sense of community. Like, I like when you walk down the street, you see all the little kids playing, you know? Everybody's all together, hanging out, playing cards and stuff. I like to see that.
Between the 1960s and the 1980s, East Harlem experienced a period of decline. During this time, the city's population dropped as the local economy underwent profound changes and tens of thousands of city residents moved to newly created suburbs. Frustrated by the lack of demand for housing and in some cases motivated by racist fears of their African American and Puerto Rican tenants, Many landlords in East Harlem and other lower-income neighborhoods stopped investing in repairs, heating systems, and other services. City leaders looked to large and numerous public housing projects and subsidized housing to handle the issues of low-income residents. By the 1960s, East Harlem had one of the highest concentrations of public housing in the entire city. Fed up, community members began to organize. Tenants formed associations and applied money they would pay in rent to make repairs in abandoned buildings, and small community organizations were formed.
My name is Gustavo Rosado, and many people know me as Gus, and I am the executive director of El Barrio's Operation Fight Back. Operation Fight Back is a community-based, not-for-profit organization. We got our name from a building that we were organizing 20 years ago that had a drug dealer in it, and getting rid of that drug dealer, the tenants organized and did a candlelight vigil in front of the building, and that little movement was called Operation Fight Back. And once we got that one building done, then we wrote a little proposal which we got $20,000 for, and that's what we started Operation Fight Back with, that small grant.
In 1968, El Barrio, East Harlem, was literally falling apart. I mean, literally. I mean, bricks were falling off of buildings. The housing stock in El Barrio was 80 to 100 years old. There were abandoned buildings, there were vacant lots, and a group of people came together, Morris Wittenberg, one of them, and they pulled their personal resources together. They came up with $10,000. They bought the worst building on 104th Street. I think it was 153 East. And then they got a loan from the city, $200,000, I think it was. They renovated the building, and that was the birth of Hope Community. The group that came together were community leaders, social workers, clergy, just concerned community activists.
There's been a lot of changes. Some of them have been positive, and I've always felt that part of what Operation Fight Back started doing was trying to stabilize the neighborhood, in particular with housing. Back when we started, there were a lot of landlords that were milking the buildings. They would collect as much rent as they could, and they would do as little services as they could. And the city of New York was managing a tremendous amount of buildings, and they kept getting more and more buildings. Their housing stock was growing very quickly, and they were not very good landlords.
By the 1990s, the city began to confiscate devalued properties burdened with tax arrears and transfer them to tenants, community organizations, and developers. These city-owned properties enabled a number of community organizations to evolve into dynamic, nonprofit property managers.
As early back, I think it was 1997, for the first time they started building north of 96th Street luxury housing. And now El Barrio has become like a prime real estate. It's unfortunate, we're fighting it, but it's gentrification, and we are committed to slowing it down, and I think we are slowing it.
So we've always focused on trying to improve the housing conditions, in particular for the lower income families. And we knew that we also sponsored some small homes, so we knew that there had to be a balance. We couldn't have a community that was just 100% low income, because that wasn't really going to be good for the neighborhood as a whole.
By the 1990s, dozens of buildings had been purchased and converted into clean, livable, and affordable rental units. At the same time, the city's economy underwent a dramatic revival, and East Harlem began to experience a rebirth. Paradoxically, the same forces that stood to improve the quality of life for long-standing East Harlem residents now threaten to displace them.
More recently, there's been the city of New York started to let private developers come in and build in what used to be exclusively for not-for-profits to build in city-owned property and vacant lands, and most of the vacant buildings that existed in El Barrio were being done by not-for-profits. And when the city started letting in private developers, then we started to see a little more middle and market rate housing. And more recently, in the last couple of years now, we've seen a lot more co-ops and condos. So although we were supportive early on, because there was a very high concentration of low-income families, and we did support the small homes to try to get a balance, during the more recent years, we're starting to tip the scale a little, where there's a higher concentration, or just more building of middle and moderate income housing and co-ops and condos. Well, I'm an architect, a preservationist, and a city planner, and I love old buildings. I love to preserve old buildings because there's a history there, and I think it's very important that people know their history. And one of the only remnants left in communities, are the old buildings and the old people. And as the old people tend to die away and pass away, the only remnant of history that you have are the older buildings. Unfortunately, East Harlem does not have that many older buildings anymore because of the glut of renovations and new construction. And I think that's a sad part of what's going on in East Harlem, is that our history is being washed away.
My name is Marion Bell, and I live here in Lakeview. And we're located on 106th and 107th, and between 5th Avenue and Madison Avenue. We have, to the north of us, we have condos, co-ops, 1400 on 5th. To the east of us, we have housing developments, public housing developments. We have a Mitchell-Lama deal right now. We are a Mitchell-Lama development. Mitchell-Lama is a government subsidy program that was given to the owners of the development so that they could provide low to middle income housing for families, essentially. And there are several developments in New York City like that. It's quite scary because we as residents don't know with our varied incomes, even if we will be eligible to move across the street into the public housing developments.
Well, currently I feel that the biggest challenge is based on the position that I have now as city council member, as a representative, and interacting with the community in different ways. But the most common concerns that we have people expressing to us are housing issues, the rise in the rents, the lack of affordable housing in the community, and also with regards to economic development opportunities. There's a lot of development happening in the community, and people want to know and understand how are they directly going to benefit from that.
Since 1992, the average per unit price of multifamily properties in East Harlem has been rising. These price increases are both a response to a changing real estate market and an impetus for further change. They reflect the fact that in recent years, developers have been able to create and sell co-op and condominium units for prices that are unprecedented in the neighborhood. One project recently reported 2-bedroom units selling for over $600,000 apiece. Landlords have also been raising rents so that renovated 2-bedroom apartments coming on the market frequently rent for $2,000 per month or more. Local residents certainly cannot afford such prices. East Harlem's average median household income rests at $21,295, much lower than the median income of $38,293 for Manhattan as a whole.
Yeah, my name is Richard Garcia, and I live in the community. I live on East 117th, between First and Pleasant. So I moved in about, I think, a year ago. From the Bronx. Originally I'm from the Bronx, East Bronx area. I live on 117, and it's one of those development blocks between First and Pleasant. So every day there's a new condo going up or there's new things happening. I have kind of mixed feelings. It's nice to see change. It's nice to be able to have kids play in the streets and not worry about, a shootout. and that kind of thing. But it's sad to see families leave, and it's sad to see people leave that can no longer afford the apartments. A huge number of people leaving, and all over East Harlem. Mostly because of the rents. You know, I guess 1998, the average rent maybe $800. 2006, maybe $1,600, and double the amount of money. The average people have not doubled their salaries, so they're being forced. From what I see, mostly in the Bronx and other areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think recently, maybe like about 2 months ago, there was a building on Madison Avenue that probably not the landlord, but someone his landlord hired came and said, give me your passport, give me your documentation. If you don't agree to move, we're going to call immigration on you. And that's a violation of every kind of right. The person wasn't even a, Homeland Security person. They had no right to ask for passport or any of these threats. All of these threats are illegal. So there are landlords that are doing that, and they basically, like I said, probably just want to get people out so they could renovate them and rent them at triple the rent that the tenants are paying at this time.
The rapidly changing housing market may be reshaping East Harlem's population. The recently released data from the Mid-Decade American Community Survey, which provides an important source of information about population trends between the decennial censuses, suggests that between 2000 and 2005, the number of non-Hispanic whites grew, rising from 7.3% to 12% of East Harlem's total population. By contrast, the number of Mexicans fell from 9.6% of the population to 6%. The number of African Americans also dropped substantially from 34.7% to 30%.
Well, if you don't have any money, you'll be moved out. I don't know. It's a problem, but that's the way it's going to happen. Well, this was very Spanish with Father Lot. Now the Spanish community is dwindling all the time. My Spanish mass may have at most 100 people. Here is where you're talking about gentrification. Yes. St. Francis is probably the greatest spot of gentrification, buildings going up and Manhattan pushing forward, and changing the nature of this parish.
Majority of my new neighbors in that end of Harlem are professionals, young, and they don't stay put long. Neighbors come and go in average 2 years. Jobs move. When you have professional tenants, they don't stay long. Especially young tenants, they leave one job and go to another better paying job just like that. So I don't see any real stability to it. Most of my neighbors that have apartments to rent, they've been changing tenants quite often. Some socialize. A very small percentage of them really socialize. Majority of them, for social activities, they take the train downtown. They just live here for the cheaper rents, and when it comes to social, banking, whatever, they take the train downtown.
People, the Spanish community are more into community. Like after Mass, they would go down coffee. There's an active, charismatic group that gathers a lot of people from East Harlem and other parish when they have retreats and stuff like that, religious activities. And also like Christmas parties, and they back each other pretty much. And then you got the white population they're just massing out. They don't want anything else.
It's I guess you could say people who are normally be living in 86th Street, who feel a little bit more confident that they're not going to get mugged in this area, and the rents are still about $500-600 cheaper than if they were to live 20 blocks south.
And like, I don't like now that I feel how, I don't know, like they moving us out.
They turning the front.
They building condominiums and higher, not even Caucasian, higher. They upgrade
more profitable. Because like now the new buildings and stuff that are being built are like $1,800 a month,
which nobody can afford. That's what
nobody in the community can afford, and that leads to like more and more rich people coming in and kicking out the poor people. Even though that's what you call it, like that's why we're here, because everything is low.
some of the things that
I would make sure that buildings that go up are mixed income. You know, there's something called a 20/80 or 40/60, whatever the percentage is, because if you separate them, if you just build, let's say, low-income housing, that everyone coming out of that building, oh, she's low. Everyone coming out of that one, oh my gosh, that's the richest guy on the block. If you put them all in a building, and we have such buildings, I have no idea who you are, and people look at each other differently. You don't feel embarrassed, oh, I'm on the poor side and you're not, and blah, blah, blah. Because once I think that you break those barriers, you know, the economics, and people, you know, are fine. But I think some people are feeling intimidated that, you know, my neighborhood now is being, not invaded, but people are coming in of different status, income, and so they feel maybe, you know, I don't feel right, or I'm looking down at, or maybe the other way around. People are looking and say, well, I'm a little scared, I don't know him, you know, he's just a super, I don't really relate, I don't know how to relate, and so I think buildings mix.
And one of the things that we're doing is trying to engage young people in taking more active role in their community and being agents of change in the community, and I think that that's something that's very important.
Although East Harlem is rapidly changing, it is not too late to take action. By working together to protect the neighborhood's remaining affordable housing and prevent landlords from moving ahead with illegal evictions, community members may be able to put the brakes on this gathering displacement crisis, and in the process ensure that their rights are respected, that their interests and wishes for their community become fulfilled, and that the cultures of the neighborhood are preserved.
We as residents have lived through the change in Central Park. We've lived through the crack epidemic. We have lived through the changes that have taken place in the public housing facilities adjacent to us. We have every right to stay here, to maintain our existence and our presence in this community as condos pop up, as co-ops pop up, as stores and restaurants open and offer us a variety of foods, you know, from all walks of life, as we have museums that increase their exhibits and bring to us more opportunities for positive social engagement. We deserve to be here.
Alright, I want to give a shout out to El Barrio, Harlem, everybody.
Yeah, Harlem.
There we go. That's what we're here for, Harlem. The heart of Harlem, always real.
Johnson's better.
Always Harlem. Community is where it's at. I don't live in a project.
I'm Dick and Harry.
To Carmen.
2 more questions, then we're done.
It helps with the breathing. Even talk about it. It's gonna take a few years. Maybe I get windows. Airport right now. We're bouncing back and forth between different sections. Yeah, Pasha wants, that's me for the release. Where's the release? You guys must come up with release.
Did you ever get that other cable channel to interview today?
They're coming, I think today.
What time?
Después de las 5.
Yeah.
Yeah, I told them.
I encouraged her to get another one, but
No.
No?
That takes weeks.
It helps with the
We even
grief.
talk about it. Yeah.
All right.